Now, I know exactly what you're thinking. Not another video review of Dawn of the Dead, another Dawn of the Dead retrospective, another thoughts on Dawn of the Dead. But please stay with me, because I think I have a bit of a different take on it to a lot of people, hopefully. And hopefully you'll find this entertaining or interesting. So I saw Dawn of the Dead in a very different way to a lot of other people. So Dawn of the Dead was actually not the first of Romero's films that I saw. I think the majority of George A. Romero fans, their first exposure to George A. Romero was either Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead. For me, it was very different. So it was the third installment of the Dead trilogy was the first film that I saw, Day of the Dead. And that says a lot about the early home video days in Australia here, where I live. And basically, as far as series of movies went, more often than not, you'd be seeing patchy parts of trilogies and sequels and so on and so forth. And basically you had what you had. So the only George Romero movie within reasonable driving distance of where I grew up was Day of the Dead for many years, and that was all that I was exposed to. This was pre-internet, pre-tape trading, pre-streaming definitely, pre-DVD, pre-home video market in terms of retail. So basically you had what you had, and what I had was Day of the Dead. So the Day of the Dead Australian home video release was quite different. It was basically a little bit misleading. The screen grab on the cover, I believe it was released by Palace Explosive or someone like that. I may be wrong, may be misremembering, but it was a screen grab of Return of the Living Dead, believe it or not. So it showed the zombie crouched over the paramedic in the rain, that very familiar image for fans of Return of the Living Dead. So Day of the Dead was my first exposure. So I know a lot of people were disappointed by Day of the Dead. They either saw it in theatres originally after hoping that they'd get a similar experience to Dawn of the Dead, or something like that, or they saw it after Dawn of the Dead on home video or on DVD. And generally, I think that leads to a lot of disappointment for people. But I saw Day of the Dead. Basically, it was all that I knew. It was a case of less is more as a horror fan. And I was hooked. I was wrapped. I watched it scores and scores of times. I probably paid for it 25 times over with continual rentals as a kid. And that was the first George Romero zombie movie I saw. The second movie was... I did find a copy of Night of the Living Dead quite a few years later on a label called Hollywood House Video here in Australia. It was a double feature with Francis Ford Coppola's Dementia 13, presumably because both films were in the public domain. So that was my first exposure to Night of the Living Dead. And still, Dawn of the Dead remained unseen for quite a few years. And then something miraculous happened. My father won a trip to Hawaii with his work. And back in those days, only the rich kids went overseas, of course. The rest of us took domestic holidays, caravans down at Kyola and so on and so forth. And things are actually a bit tougher right now, because even the trip down to Kyola to stay in a caravan is a bit of a luxury that most can't afford nowadays. But I digress. So we took the trip to Hawaii. One of our stops there was in a mall in Honolulu called Ala Moana. And surprise, surprise, I found a home video section, which was quite rare at the time. So we didn't really have a lot of home videos for sale for the most part at the time. But they did have a copy of a Thorn EMI copy of Dawn of the Dead on VHS. So I excitedly bought it up as my lone Hawaii souvenir. I didn't want a lei, or I didn't want a piece of painted coral. I wanted a copy of Dawn of the Dead on home video. That was enough for me as a kid. And then I experienced the disappointment and tragedy when I returned home of NTSC. So that copy of Dawn of the Dead, unfortunately, wouldn't play on Australian VHS machines. It would kind of play with massive amounts of static, so there was the pathetic vision of a 12 or 13-year-old me leaning his ear up to the TV to try and hear dialogue from a bit of a holy grail of horror films that I had yet to see. So that was my very first experience with Dawn of the Dead, and much later I started going further afield, and fortunately I found a copy of Dawn of the Dead elsewhere in another town, and it was my first exposure to Dawn of the Dead. It had the Banned in Queensland label on the box, of course, which I've gone into in an earlier video. And so Dawn of the Dead was the third of Romero's Dead trilogy that I experienced. So again, I was blown away. I'd started off with Day of the Dead, which is a lot smaller in scope, of course, than Dawn of the Dead. And then I'd seen Night of the Living Dead, which was also a lot smaller in scope. And then on to Day of the Dead. So then on to Dawn of the Dead, sorry. So Dawn of the Dead was big, it was cartoonish, it was exciting, it was apocalyptic, and remains my favourite horror film to this day. And many, many, many years later, when I started working and saving and all the things you do as a grown-up, I was fortunate enough to visit the Munroville Mall. And fortunate enough, a lot of things had already been torn down, unfortunately. I did get to cross the bridge over the pond and see a few other locations. It was hard to find a few locations, but we did it, and that was quite a surreal experience, and really added to my fondness for this movie. So that's my whole lived experience, I guess, with Dawn of the Dead, with George Romero's 1978 movie Dawn of the Dead, my favourite horror film. Hopefully this video has been a little bit more interesting than the other 20,000 review videos out there. I think we've all seen enough of those ad nauseum, probably, if you're interested whatsoever in this movie. But if you'd like to find out more about my channel, and you'd like to check out more of the obscure movies that I talk about, please like, share and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.